Pipeline Studio is about understanding your workflow and knowing when it's running smoothly. Signal versus noise in a creative pipeline. Every creative pipeline processes information. Ideas enter the system. Inputs accumulate. Feedback appears. Outputs are produced. At every stage, information is moving. Some of that information clarifies what is happening. Some of it interferes. This is where signal and noise begin to matter. A signal is information that reduces uncertainty. It changes understanding. It helps the system become more interpretable. Noise does the opposite. It adds volume without adding clarity. The challenge is that both travel through the same pipeline. They arrive through the same channels. They use the same language. They often feel equally important. This makes them difficult to distinguish. In the early stages of a creative pipeline, signal is easier to recognize. There is less information. Fewer inputs compete for attention. Changes stand out. But as the pipeline grows, information accumulates. More ideas, more feedback, more activity. Nothing is removed, everything is added. Over time, this accumulation shifts the balance. Noise increases faster than signal, not because signal disappears, but because it becomes harder to see. This is how pipelines become noisy without failing. The system still produces output, work still gets done, but interpretation weakens. Instead of understanding improving over time, clarity begins to erode. People respond more and interpret less. They react instead of observe. This creates a subtle form of signal loss. Signal loss is not the absence of meaningful information. It is the inability to recognize it when it appears. In noisy pipelines, signals are still present. They arrive early. They arrive quietly, and they are often overlooked. As noise increases, urgency increases with it. More things demand attention. More inputs feel time sensitive. More decisions feel immediate. This pressure favors noise. Loud information spreads easily. Frequent information feels important. Visible activity feels meaningful. Signals rarely behave this way. They do not repeat constantly. They do not demand response. They often feel uncertain. This makes them easy to dismiss. Over time, the pipeline adapts to this imbalance. Attention shifts toward what is loud instead of what is clarifying, what is frequent instead of what is relevant. The system does not break, it drifts. Outputs continue, but understanding becomes harder to maintain. This is the core problem signal and noise create in creative pipelines. Not inefficiency, not failure, loss of interpretability. When a pipeline becomes hard to read, direction feels unclear even when effort remains high. Decisions feel heavier, progress feels ambiguous, and the instinctive response is to add more information. But more information rarely restores clarity. It usually increases noise. Understanding signal and noise at the system level is the first step toward keeping a pipeline interpretable over time, not by removing activity, but by recognizing what actually clarifies. This loss of interpretability often goes unnoticed because work is still happening, because output still exists, because motion continues, but motion is not clarity. When signal becomes difficult to recognize, people stop trusting their understanding of the system. They rely more heavily on surface indicators, on visibility, on immediacy. This reinforces noise. What is easiest to notice begins to feel most important. What is most frequent begins to feel most meaningful. And slowly, the pipeline trains itself to prioritize attention over understanding. This is not a flaw in individuals. It is a property of systems under information load. Recognizing this pattern is not about control or correction. It is about awareness. Awareness of how information behaves once volume exceeds clarity. That awareness is what allows a creative pipeline to remain readable over time. When a creative pipeline becomes difficult to interpret, the effects compound quietly. Decisions take longer. Confidence erodes. Direction feels less certain even when effort remains high. This does not happen because people stop caring. It happens because clarity becomes harder to access. In noisy systems, attention is constantly redirected. New inputs arrive before previous ones can be understood. Context fragments. Over time, this trains the pipeline to value responsiveness over comprehension. Things that demand immediate attention begin to dominate. Things that require reflection are delayed or ignored. This is how noise reshapes behavior, not by force, but by persistence. Signals continue to appear in these conditions, but they rarely spread. They are noticed by individuals, then lost in the system. They are not reinforced. They are not shared clearly. They are not given time to accumulate meaning. Noise, by contrast, propagates easily. It repeats. It multiplies. It fills space. As a result, the pipeline becomes reactive. Activity increases, but understanding does not deepen. This creates a familiar feeling, the sense that everything is moving but nothing is resolving. At this stage, the instinctive response is to intervene, to add structure, to add input, to add information. But intervention without distinction often accelerates the problem, because the issue is not a lack of data, it is the inability to separate signal from noise. Clarity does not come from adding more, it comes from recognizing what already matters. A readable pipeline is not one with less information. It is one where information has weight, where some inputs are allowed to inform understanding and others are recognized as interference. This does not require certainty. It requires awareness. Awareness that not all movement is progress, not all visibility is insight, not all urgency deserves response. When signal is recognized, orientation returns. Decisions feel grounded, even if outcomes remain uncertain. Direction becomes easier to sense. Effort reconnects with intent. When noise dominates, the pipeline still functions, but meaning thins out. Understanding signal and noise at this level is not about control or optimization. It is about preserving interpretability, keeping the system readable as information accumulates. Signal and noise are always present. The difference is whether they are confused. And clarity begins the moment they are not. This confusion has a cost. When a pipeline cannot distinguish signal from noise, effort increases while clarity declines. People spend more time reacting and less time understanding. They search for certainty in volume. They mistake repetition for importance. They assume visibility equals value. Over time, this changes how work feels. Progress becomes harder to measure. Decisions feel heavier than they should. Confidence gives way to hesitation, not because capability is lacking, but because interpretation is compromised. A pipeline in this state is not failing. It is saturated. Information continues to move, but meaning struggles to keep pace. This is why clarity is a system property. It does not live in any single input. It emerges when signals are allowed to stand out long enough to be recognized. When noise is seen as interference instead of instruction, this does not require removing noise entirely. That is impossible. It requires knowing what noise is so it is not mistaken for insight. When that distinction is present, the pipeline becomes navigable again. Understanding stabilizes, direction reappears, effort reconnects with intent. This is what signal and noise determine at the system level. Not speed, not output, but whether the work can still be understood as it continues to move forward. This concludes this session. Let what you've heard settle before continuing.